Okay, well, thanks everyone for coming out, and I think you all have Saving California in your bag there, and you know, I do recommend reading the Wildfire chapter in its entirety. Lots of great stuff there, and lots of great stuff I had to cut out for length purposes, but there's a lot of good detail. So, you know, Carrie, as I got started here, as I was getting prepared, Carrie sent me the lyrics from a Dave Alvin song. Dave, do you all know a blues singer from Whittier? Anyway, California's burning, you can smell it in the air, you may be rich or poor, but you know that fire don't care. And it's a good song, and anyway, I'm not going to sing it, so don't worry about that. But we all know it, right? California's alternating tinderbox and flood situation has been a fixture since the state's existence, and the two, of course, are tied. I had done for PRI last year a book on water policy, and anyway, it's the same situation the state confronts with virtually every issue. There's always a big problem. I think the majority always, they identify problems correctly, but not always, but they at least get the big ones, but they go off into some netherworld. Instead of dealing with the nuts and bolts of the problem, our leaders try to sell us these big pipe dreams. So far, the Newsom administration's taken two tacks towards the wildfire situation. The first is to double down on climate change policy in the hopes that California's leadership can change the entire globe's climate and then ultimately will reduce fire risk. How do you think that's going to go? And that lets them make big, bold pronouncements, right? And lets them off the hook as fire and drought problems persist. So the second is summed up in an editorial I wrote for the Southern California News Group. Legislation from a bipartisan group of California state legislators tackles an important problem, the state's ongoing battles with wildfires, in the same old way. It spends more money hiring more government employees, you think that'll work, but fails to address why the current budget isn't doing the job. And as the Assemblyman noted, we only measure what we spend. I think when the governor was asked about accountability for how it's already been spent, he said he's not a city manager. I wish he were just a city manager. Anyway, it also includes a host of union job protections for seasonal workers and all sorts of union work rules, so that'll fix our problem. But as Dan Kolkey's chapter in Saving California makes clear, you know, the state can indeed deal with wildfires and meet its climate change goals. It can actually do both. It takes creativity, a willingness to challenge vested interests. I know that's already we're getting into wishful thinking, and the wisdom to focus on making the state more resilient, you know, regardless of what Mother Nature throws our way. And that's a point, you know, I made on water policy and wildfire. We should be dealing with these things, making our state resilient rather than pipe dreams. So anyway, let's get going. I'm going to get started here with Assemblyman James Gallagher. He's the new Assembly Republican leader. He's represented the 3rd Assembly District since 2014. Before coming to the Assembly, he served on the Sutter County Board of Supervisors for 6 years. I actually first met him at a hotel bar in St. Pete during the GOP convention. And anyway, he advocates for small businesses and farmers in his law practice, and he's a partner in his family's farming operation. So please welcome Assembly Republican leader James Gallagher.
All right, well, thank you, Stephen. I appreciate that introduction. And I remember that, man. That was a good time.
I knew you were going to go far.
We've been through a lot since then. Well, first of all, thank you to PRI for putting this on, and Tim and Naya, you know, who I've known for a long time, back to when I was actually an Assembly fellow, working in the legislature for Doug LaMalfa. And when Tim reached out, I said, absolutely, man, I'd love to participate in this. But I'll move right into it, and maybe just start with, you know, some of the background on this issue, because it's something that we've been, you know, really fighting about, trying to push, you know, push forward a reasonable forestry policy for quite some time now. And it kind of goes back to, you know, the 90s when, you know, there was a big push against the timber industry and the spotted owl and the shutting down of much of the timber industry in California. And at that time, there were many people who came to committee hearings in the legislature and in the halls of Congress in Washington, D.C. as well, that warned, if you do this, this policy is going to result in devastating wildfires. It's only a matter of time. And if you go back, you'll see those in the minutes of people coming and making that exact case before legislative bodies. And at the time, Congressman Wally Herger, who was represented my area for many years, talked about this issue and had been pushing for a reasonable, responsible forestry policy. In fact, one of the famous things that happened during that time was what was called the Quincy Library Group. Maybe some of you have been around this long enough to remember that, where Dianne Feinstein and Congressman Herger and other stakeholders actually convened a sitting roundtable in the Quincy Library in Quincy, California, Plumas County, to try and hash out a reasonable, balanced approach to forestry management. And at the time, it was something that actually did result in some good progress on the issue. But unfortunately, the damage had kind of already been done. And California and the U.S. Forest Service sort of adopted what I like to call the John Muir view of forestry, as opposed to the Gifford Pinochet philosophy of conservation, of treating our forests as a resource that we need to conserve. You have to utilize it, but we also steward it, for the long term, so that resource remains viable for the long term, as opposed to a John Muir approach, which is just preservation for preservation's sake. Leave it alone. Don't do anything in there. And the result of decades of that kind of philosophy, probably exhibited most by the Sierra Club and some of the things that they've pushed forward or stopped over the years through litigation in the halls of the legislature, stopping any kind of reasonable approach to forestry management, has led to exactly that. We have, millions of acres of dead and dying trees, of overgrown forests that have become tinder boxes waiting for a match. And we are seeing the results of that. Now, you can talk about climate change, and I always say that climate change is really the exacerbator of this, if you will. But it's not the fundamental cause of these wildfires. Yes, longer periods of dry temperatures, less, water that, in the vegetation that makes it so that these things can go up. But the bottom line is there's too much dead and dying trees. There's timber. There's undergrowth and density in these forests that make it so that we have crowning fires that reach to the top, and it devastates everything. And by the way, also kills all the wildlife that some of these proponents, say that they're trying to protect. In addition to killing people and homes, I represent paradise. So this cut very close home to home for me, and having to deal with a massive crisis that's still ongoing in that town. And I'll tell you, those people are really resilient. That's really the story, is how these people have risen from that. And now over 1,000 homes have actually been rebuilt in Paradise as we speak today. Those people are coming back, but should have never gotten to that point. And so I've seen, as a fellow for Doug Lamolfin, I can remember one of the first bills that I worked on, and with Cindy Hillary, who was in the office, was a LD at the time, was forestry management, just the ability to cut small trees, small diameter trees, and to be able to go in there and do that. Now we were able to get that bill passed, but it was like moving heaven and earth to get it. And it was, at the end of the day, even Doug felt it was a watered down version of what he really wanted, and what really needed to be done, because with the amount of influence that Sierra Club and others had, it was really difficult to get anything substantive through. And there's been many measures. Senator Dowley, who's been a real champion, move things through, but it's just very tough to get substantive things through. And it's only been more recently that we've been able to make that push. So 901 here recently that actually finally put some significant money towards forestry management projects. 5 years worth. We got that renewed last year, so we're going to get another 5 years of continuous appropriation, $200 million a year, out of the Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund, which is really where it should come from. And I know we're going to talk. The other experts on this panel will speak to that. But it makes total sense because by doing these management activities, you're reducing carbon emissions just by the activity itself, because a dead and dying forest emits carbon. A healthy forest is a carbon sink. And then not to mention, when you touch off these fires, you're putting millions of metric tons of carbon into the atmosphere that doesn't necessarily have to be there. Now, the Sierra Club and others will say, well, that's just natural. Well, no, it's clearly not natural, because this is not what we would have had under normal circumstances. And we had, I think last year alone, the fire was somewhere upwards of 60 million metric tons of carbon emitted. In the 2018 fires, it was 50 million. So we are just exponentially increasing the amount of carbon through these catastrophic wildfires that shouldn't be there if we had a reasonable policy. Now, that is starting to shift. I would like to see a whole lot more done on that front. But as I said, we got the continuous appropriation put in there, close to $1 billion last year in last year's budget towards several different measures, but a significant amount of that money was dedicated towards forestry management, and that includes thinning projects. It includes prescribed burn, which I think prescribed burn projects have the propensity to do that. Long before any of us were here, the Native Americans stewarded these forests by igniting fires. And they knew that was something that had to be done to protect that resource. We kind of showed up and we stopped doing that, and we started putting out fires, and then we've had this radical policy for the last few decades you've done nothing in there. So that is really how we've gotten to this point. The good news is we're starting to make greater investments, but we need to make sure that they actually get down to the ground level. So I think that's the biggest challenge right now, is, as Scott Rod at Capitol Public Radio pointed out in his investigative journalism last year, is we put this money out there, but not a whole lot of work got done. I think they touted something like 90,000 acres, which is nowhere near where we need to be. The goal is to get to 500,000 on the states a year. We're nowhere near that goal yet. But they said they did 90 and they only did 11,000 acres in actuality, and that came out in that investigative journalism. So, people like Vince, who you just heard from, and myself on the budget committee, have really been pressing to say, look, we want to know how this money is getting spent. Show us, the administration and Cal Fire and all the stakeholders, how many acres we're treating and how are we treating it? And let's track this. Let's be accountable for the money that we're putting in there. So I think that will be a big challenge in the future. That's something we're going to be really focused on in this upcoming legislative session. And with that, I'll cut off because I'm probably over my time.
You're good. Well, thank you. Okay. Now, the Honorable Daniel Kolkey has served as Associate Justice of the California Court of Appeal for the 3rd District and as counsel for the Governor of California. He has been a partner in the San Francisco office of Gibson, Dunn, and Crutcher, chairing the firm's California Appellate Law Practice Group. He was named by Daily Journal in 2018 as one of California's top 100 lawyers. Dan is a Pacific Research Institute board member and chair of the California Reform Committee and author of our Wildfire chapter in Saving California. Please welcome Dan Cole. Oh, please.
Former litigator and judge, I prefer to speak standing. So first of all, let me say I really appreciate and agree with everything that Assemblyman Gallagher has said. Let me say that I think, one of the problems is that the state is not prioritizing its funding and its actions the way it should, which is exactly what the Assemblyman was saying. I want to just, before I go into solutions to mitigate the wildfire threat that California is experiencing, I want to just give you some metrics as to the scope of this problem. Since the year 2000, 18 of the 20 largest wildfires took place. Just since 2000, 18 of the 20 largest wildfires took place. And since 2010, 15 of the most destructive wildfires out of 20 were experienced by California. And this means not only the loss of homes and lives, but it also has a great impact on health, because these wildfires, well beyond the area that the wildfire is directly addressing, as you know, is spreading all these small particulates, which are very harmful to your health. The California legislative analyst has found that 25% of small particulates in the U.S. are caused by wildfires. What else do these do? They cause your homeowner's insurance to go up. The 2017 and 2018 fires resulted in charges to the insurance industry of $29 billion. So, of course, the premiums are going to go up. It's not the insurance company's fault that we have these wildfires. It's the fault of the governor and the legislature for not doing sufficient work to mitigate the consequences of these wildfires. And apropos to what the Assemblyman said, California is responsible for about 1% of global emissions. So whatever California does on climate change, it's questionable whether or not the source of roughly 1% of global emissions is going to have a lot of impact in arresting or ending climate change. What the state needs to be doing is, sure, we should move towards, more renewables, but what the state should be doing is prioritizing dealing with the consequences of climate change, which we're having right now in terms of wildfire and drought, rather than a quixotic effort to prioritize the arresting of climate change through renewable energy policies. And let me just say, and again, the Assemblyman pointed this out, is that the wildfires are actually neutralizing any progress we make in our carbon footprint. And as he noted, the 2018 fires, they spewed so many tons of carbon dioxide, it was 9 times the amount of carbon dioxide that we reduced the previous year. So these wildfires are, by not doing what we need to do with respect to wildfires, we're actually undermining the policies that supposedly are going to try and arrest climate change. We've got California has 33 million acres of forest. Half of that, 15 million of those acres need treatment. Of the 15, 10 million are in federal lands, 5 million are on state lands either owned by state or local government or by private individuals that are subject to California's law. But what are we doing? So what we need to do is we need to start thinning these dense forests that have these closely spaced, thin young trees, all this dead timber, all this dry vegetation, which act as what are called ladder fuels that bring the flames up to the canopy and it spreads. So you've got to thin these forests, you need resources to do it. But let's look at how the state, except maybe perhaps very recently, is expending those resources. In the 2020-21 budget cycle, the legislative analyst found that 68% of the funds from the Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund, 68%, went to projects other than addressing the consequences of climate change. And just to give an example, in the 2020-21 cycle, $1.2 billion went to high-speed rail. This is from the Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund. 1.2 billion went to high-speed rail, transit, and affordable and sustainable communities. And only 200 million went to forest health, forest resilience, namely trying to do things to reduce all the vegetation and so on in the forests. The governor's current budget, starting July 1, that's the 2022-2023 budget, that has $3.4 billion going to zero-emission vehicles, $3.4 billion for zero-emission vehicles, of which $676 million comes from the Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund. Compare the $3.4 billion going to zero-emission vehicles to simply $600 million going to forest resilience, of which only $200 million is coming from the Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund. So what we need to do is start really funding the thinning of these dense forests that create the fire ladders and so on, which doesn't mean cutting down the forest, it just means thinning the forest so that it reduces the risk of wildfire. Now, there's a couple ways of doing this. One is prescribed burns, mentioned by the Assemblyman, and also Brian is going to talk about prescribed burns, and so I won't spend any time on that. Next are using crews to remove the dead timber and thin the forests. That costs money, however. And then the third is commercial harvesting of forests, which would not be using public funds to thin the forests. Now, there are two obstacles to doing this. Obstacle one, and we heard from Chris Carr earlier today, is CEQA, and the other is the Forest Practice Act. Both of those acts require environmental impact statements before you can do any forest management project, including timber projects. And that is expensive. In fact, as the California legislative analyst said, that this makes it too expensive for most private landowners to do what they would want to do in terms of providing forest resilience on the lands that they own. So that is the number one problem. The other problem is that if you're going to use lumber companies to try and help thin the forest without a cost to the state, the fact is that we don't have any more enough lumber mills to process the lumber. That started declining in the 1990s, just as the Assemblyman said. And so how do we handle those two obstacles? Well, on the environmental impact statement front, and Chris Carr mentioned this, is that you can provide exemptions, but beyond legislative exemptions, the governor has the power in a state of emergency to suspend any regulatory statute, because the governor can declare an emergency if there are conditions that cause extreme peril to the safety of persons or property, and certainly great risk of wildfires in particular areas that are particularly dangerous. That is a condition of great peril to persons and property. With that declaration, the governor can suspend any regulatory statute, which would include CEQA and the Forest Practice Act. And that doesn't mean that there's no environmental protection. The governor has the ability to suspend the statutes in return for the entry of a contract that provides various protections by whichever landowner or timber company is going to do the cutting to make sure it's done correct. The contract can provide penalties if the lumber company or the landowner goes beyond what the landowner should do. And recently, my former court, the 3rd District Court of Appeals, said that the governor even has the power to legislate during a state of emergency. So the bottom line is, just through contract and suspension, you could speed up all this if the governor had the will to do that. Now, Chris Carr's study indicates that the governor did issue an executive order some years ago that exempted some projects, but we have got a problem on such a scale. When 18 of the 20 largest wildfires have taken place since 2000, we've got a huge problem, and that means taking real decisive action to clean up our forests and make them healthy. So with that, I'm going to stop. We could talk a little bit about the whole energy issue and how the transmission lines and so on are also responsible for some of these wildfires, but I'll leave that for questions and answers later.
Thanks, Dan. Brian Isom is a research manager at the Center for Growth and Opportunity at Utah State University. His past research has covered issues relating to the institutional impacts on wildfire management and institutional water management in the western United States, among other topics. He is an avid outdoorsman and is very interested in the way public policy affects all aspects of the environment. Please welcome Brian Ice. Yeah.
Step up here and stretch my legs a little bit. I guess to start, so I just want to echo everything that's been said by my co-panelists. There's a lot of very interesting and I think very depressing statistics around wildfire, right? When Sally was actually opening up, she mentioned that it feels like California is no longer so golden. It's because, well, it's increasingly charred. Because the fires that are burning across California and a lot of the western United States are just getting worse and worse every single year. And I think one of the biggest frustrations as somebody who researches wildfire is the fact that when these wildfires are burning, right, the news cycle and the discussion that seems to center around them is increasingly focused on, we had this fire, here's why fires are worse because of climate change, here's what we need to do to stop climate change, and here's how much money we're going to spend to solve climate change, right? And while climate change is a huge, decades-long issue, that feels a lot like you're sitting in a boat in the middle of a lake and you sprung a leak, and rather than plugging the leak, you start yelling for somebody to drain the lake, right? Is we have this massive issue, and rather than approaching the very specific problem we have with, forests that are poorly managed and taking steps to fix those, we're trying to spend and spend and spend to stop, climate change and this huge decades-long complex issue that, who knows at the end of the day what that's going to look like in 10, 20, 30 years. So like Dan mentioned, and I'll second, I really enjoyed your chapter in the book, Saving California. I think it's definitely worth the read. But as he mentioned, one of the big opportunities that we have to try and kind of rein things in terms of the wildfire issue is increasing the amount of effort we put into prescribed burning. Now, prescribed fires are very different than what you typically see as a normal wildfire, right? Prescribed fires are the fires that the western United States is kind of habituated to be used to, right? These are fires that burn small. They, like Dan mentioned, they burn the ladder fuels, right? They stay low. They don't get up into the crowns of trees. And so you're not seeing these fires that are just like burning through forests and consuming everything they come across, right? If you've ever seen a video of somebody doing a prescribed fire, you've got a few firemen who are out there with drip torches, and there's just this little line of fire kind of burning across the ground, right? Just eating up all of these fuels that can cause problems when they really dry out. The other benefits of these prescribed fires is because they're not burning entire forests, right? They're not getting up into the trees, they're not burning everything in sight, is they actually are a lot better environmentally, health-wise, and like fiscally than an actual wildfire, right? There's a lot of studies that have been done that show that the particulate matter that's emitted from prescribed burns usually is 3 times less than the particulate matter you get when you have a wildfire that is burning. There was actually a study that just came out a couple years ago where they modeled and looked at if we had effectively, done prescribed burning on much of the western United States that has burned from wildfires in recent years, we would have reduced the severity of wildfires on those lands by 60%, right? Because there would not have been any of those excess fuels to allow these fires to kind of burn out of control. So the reality of the situation is, if we can change the focus away from, large spending and, well, we don't know what to do about a fire until it starts burning and homes are at risk and, suddenly we need to stop them. And then we're spending, billions of dollars on these fires. If we're getting out in front of these things and, we're able to cut through some of these regulatory barriers that have been discussed, not just CEQA and the National Environmental Policy Act, but reforming the way that we monitor and restrict burning through the Clean Air Act, right? And saying, okay, so if you run a prescribed fire, you are kind of beholden to the regulatory restrictions under the Clean Air Act. And so that stops a lot of fires from happening because they're saying, well, we want to protect the air quality, we want to keep people's lungs healthy, we don't want to put them at risk of some of that particulate matter. But then when you have a fire burn, right, nobody's beholden or liable for that wildfire that's burning, that's pumping out, and darkening the skies over San Francisco like we saw in 2020. So it's kind of, do we want to put this under control and manage it and kind of get these fires working under our control and at our best practice, or are we going to allow them to burn out of control, continue to put communities at danger, and put the economy of California and a lot of the western U.S. at danger? Because these fires are going to keep burning. It's just, are we going to be in control of them and managing them in a way that is helpful to us and the ecosystems out here? Or are we just going to constantly be running and trying to adapt and flee from these fires as they continue to consume communities and cause huge problems in the West? So I think I'll keep it short. If you guys have questions, we can kind of get into specifics. But yeah, looking forward to chatting a little bit. Thanks.
Okay, I have a handful of questions, and then we'll go to the audience. Dan, can you just detail specifically how the Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund could be better used?
All right, well, so basically, I think that rather than having all this money go to high-speed rail, transit, zero-emission vehicles, it ought to be going to wildfire reduction, which means using the money for crews to help thin forests, using it for prescribed burns where appropriate. The other thing that I had mentioned is that we have a major issue with our transmission lines and power lines because they're very aged in this state. PG&E had a study done in 2017, an internal presentation, and it found that the average age of their transmission towers were 68 years, but the mean life for the transmission towers were 65 years. So we've got this aging, structure for our power lines, and in fact utility power lines have caused 9 of the 20 most destructive fires in California's history. So I think, frankly, the state ought to not only be putting this money to forest resilience rather than zero-emission vehicles, but it also ought to be using the money to assist the utilities in strengthening their power lines and their transmission equipment. And I think that the state owes something to utilities because the state's been requiring these utilities to spend more with all this, renewable energy requirements. And so at the same time that it increases their costs, the state then, of course, controls what they can charge. So you're controlling what they can charge, you increase their costs, and then you say, well, why aren't you taking care of your power lines? I think this, and frankly, it would be a benefit for the state's public to assist with dealing with these aged power lines and trimming the trees around the power lines rather than leaving it to the utilities, because trees falling on these power lines have also contributed to a number of the recent fires.
Okay, great, thank you. Brian, are you familiar with in Arizona, Governor Ducey passed a law that allows inmates to do brush clearance, just as like in our state we have inmates do firefighting, because we pay our firefighters, $300,000 a year,
right,
so we don't have enough for, plus their pensions, but that's a different issue. But anyway, but that seems like a good idea. What do you think? Have you looked at that, or have you, or what ideas along that lines might you have?
So I know in California there's actually a sizable force of inmate firefighters, and I think one of the big issues, and this is something that I know I've looked into a little bit, that I've seen discussed a bit, but is the issue of there's a lot of training that goes into using and getting inmates kind of ready and in these crews to fight fires, and then as soon as they are released from prison, there's no recourse for them to continue in that profession, right? So you have a kind of a supply of labor where these inmates have, ideally they've been reformed, they have found an opportunity to pursue a career that gives them meaning and that they enjoy, and then as soon as they are released, licensing standards within the state basically make it impossible for them to then be employed as firefighters. And so I think there's definitely opportunities there, ways to improve, upon the labor availability, because I think traditional fire crews are very expensive, and labor is one of the big issues, right? It's seasonal work. It's hard to find people to.
Yeah, and what I
work
like
on
that
these.
they did there is they actually use them for the brush clearance all year round, so that
Right.
seems like a pretty cool idea.
Right.
Jim, question about on insurance, and we're insurance seems to be one of the most important ways to discourage building in high fire-prone areas, but with Prop 103, it restricts the ability of insurance companies to have rates reflect the risk. So there was a bill last year that didn't pass that would simply have allowed the insurers to propose higher rates in exchange for offering coverage, because we're losing, a lot of people cannot get fire insurance, in the interface areas. So, but Prop 103, is a voter initiative, and that, that's the one, the prior approval initiative that made the insurance commissioner a czar. So is there anything that can be done legislatively within the constraints of Prop 103? Because it seems like insurance, proper insurance pricing would be a good way to deal with wildfires, right? And you probably saw it in Paradise.
Yeah, so first, just before I get into that, I misspoke earlier, and I wanted to make sure I got my stats correct. So the 2020 fire year emitted 112 million metric tons of carbon.
Wow.
And it was actually 2018 where we saw over 60 million metric tons. So that's what we're talking about when we're talking about these fires. On the insurance, and I think it's a great question. You've seen kind of two different proposals here more recently in the legislature, and one is to sort of try and control it and say, hey, as long as people do X, Y, and Z, then you insurance company must, insure it at this. And I think a lot of people say, well, that makes sense. Hey, if they're mitigating, then then you should cover. The problem is that you could drive insurers out of the region and not provide insurance whatsoever. And so, that did not move forward.
Yeah.
That did not move forward. And the other one is to kind of let the market really address this and allow for companies to come up with different formulas and metrics to write a policy for a higher fire risk insurance area. And so I'll tell you, prior to the fire, there were insurance policies, as I understand it, in Paradise, or maybe somewhere around, $1,000, $800 to $1,000 a year, right, for a homeowner's insurance policy. And one might argue, hey, with the risk of fire and what was going on, maybe that is too low, But what they've been now, what we're seeing, and not just in Paradise, but in areas that have risk of fire, is insurers backing out of the area altogether, and all they have is what's called the FAIR Plan, California FAIR Plan, and that really only gives you a basic level of insurance, and then you got to get a wraparound policy with it. And some of those policies we're talking could be upwards of $20,000 a year for a homeowner's policy. And so what I think we're looking for is something that, gives some incentives for the market to provide insurance coverage that's reasonable, and that people will say, well, I'll accept that risk and I'm willing to pay more. And I would say people in our region where they face higher risk are willing to pay more, but it's just like if your choice is $20,000 a year or something like that, $20,000 a year, it's pretty cost prohibitive. Now, to your point, Steve, people maybe the market should be the indicator to people as to what they decide to do and what risks they're willing to accept. One thing I get frustrated with in the legislature, and another policy agenda that you've seen pushed, is, well, maybe we should just stop building altogether, and no one should build, in these areas. To which I replied to my colleagues, well, maybe we shouldn't build in San Francisco anymore because they have earthquake risk. Or maybe we should no longer build in the valley, where actually we have some of the ability to provide some of the cheapest housing in the state of California. And, oh, by the way, we have a housing crisis, but maybe we shouldn't build there because there's risk of flooding. So I go, look, guys, there's no part of California that doesn't have some risk. And the key, and I think what we've been talking about here, is that the issue is mitigating risk. We never live free of risk. That's not reality. We never live completely free of risk. What we do is we mitigate the risk as best as possible and have a marketplace where people can make the decisions for themselves, as to, what they will do with their property and their money. And these are beautiful places, they're beautiful communities. Paradise, was over 100 years old, and had always known about the risk of fire, actually, but previously there was a whole lot of management, and so they'd never had a fire like this of this devastation. There'd been previous fires, but most of those fires that put them at risk were recent fires, and it's due to this lack of management long term. And so what we're hoping is that we get to a place where, after, it's going to take time, but get to a place where we can mitigate that risk by doing the much needed work that Dan described, and that will create a better risk situation for everybody.
I've got one suggestion
Sure.
on this, and that is that, if we could provide tax credits to homeowners who use fire-resistant materials, they kind of redo parts of their house with fire-resistant materials, they harden the house, we give them tax credits. I think what the legislature could do is talk with the insurance companies and say, what kinds of home hardening improvements could be done that would make a difference in your premiums? And
Right.
find out, what they think would help reduce premiums, then provide tax credits for that, and see how that works in terms of affecting the premiums.
Right.
And you could actually just provide the tax credits in those areas that are particularly prone to wildfires. So the state isn't giving away a lot of tax credits across the state. It focuses on particular geographic areas where the tax credits are important, not just for the homeowner, but for the entire community.
Good idea. By the way, Jim, were you at the press conference when Donald Trump kept referring to it as pleasure instead of paradise? That cracked me up. Anyway, and the California officials are like, paradise, paradise. Anyway, we got a couple questions.
I will say I was there, and I will say at that press conference, it was the first time I'd seen Donald Trump, Jerry Brown, and Gavin Newsom all together. And actually, what didn't get reported is they were all kind of agreeing on the fact that fuels management and forestry management was something that we needed to do.
Yeah, good point. Okay.
Thanks so much. It's a great panel. These are issues near and dear to my heart because for 20 years I've represented the California Forestry Association, which is the timber trade association, and represent their members like Sierra Pacific Industries, which owns about 1% of the private land in California forested. But one thing we're running into, indeed, in current litigation, Judge Kolkey, as you said, like we got a case up before the 3rd DCA now. We won in Tehama County, and they brought a CEQA suit to challenge an SPI THP, timber harvest plan, that had a fuel break as the principal feature of it. So that's a fire risk reduction method, right? Mm-hmm. So we'll see what the 3rd DCA does. But one thing we're finding, a bunch of the land is federal land, and it's Forest Service land, and I have a lot of friends who work for them, but they do not have a good track record of defending themselves against NEPA lawsuits. And so to get the thinning, the fuel reduction projects on those land always get challenged. They often lose. And then another dimension is, even if you can't bring out commercially usable timber from your fuel reduction or thinning, you can still use the scraps, if you will, the waste for biomass. But Center for Biological Diversity opposes biomass, will sue any biomass plant, and actually are before the Public Utilities Commission now with a rulemaking petition to eliminate credits for biomass. So it's just a very comprehensive challenge, and to get all of these pieces coordinated together, I think it's just going to take an awful lot of work.
So I might just say that, on the federal lands thing, that was a problem that bothered me, because what California state can do with respect to federal lands is extremely limited. Now, in January of this year, so January 2022, the U.S. Forest Service announced that they are developing this 10-year plan to reduce wildfire risk on federal lands, and that they intend to address 50 million acres in 10 years. At this point, it is very amorphous. It's very vague as to what extent California is going to benefit, how many acres they would address there. But the one thing that I have thought is that, look, at this state right now is controlled by the Democrats. The congressional delegation is, largely Democrats. Our congressional delegation ought to be putting a lot of pressure on the federal government to prioritize these acres in California and get the job done and get it done quickly. And I don't understand why, when you've got the Speaker of the House as a member of the California congressional delegation, and you've got such a large delegation, they aren't putting pressure on the U.S. Forest Service to really take action, because the Forest Service over the past few years has done very little in terms of thinning forests on federal lands. And it's just really hard to understand why they have been so slow and limited in what they've done.
So one more question, anybody?
Question for Mr. Kolkey. Are there any federal or state appellate court decisions that impinge on good forest practices?
Oh, that impinge on them?
That prevent the development of good forest practices?
I'm not aware of any such decisions that come to mind. I'd say that, on the overall, of course, to the extent that we're talking about CEQA or the Forest Practice Act as obstacles to quickly having forest management projects go into effect, I think that, one of the problems is that, and Chris Scar can probably speak to this better than I, but I have found that these technicalities in these 1,000-page reports can be the basis for a successful lawsuit. And you wonder if the whole purpose of CEQA is to simply inform the public as to what the impact of the project is going to be. How is it that these technicalities, tiny technicalities, can be the basis for stopping a project? And so I think that what the courts ought to be doing, so this is not yet a court decision, what the courts ought to be doing is really developing a harmless error standard, saying that when these technicalities really would not have affected whether the project got approved, so we're not going to, basically say, go back to the drawing board, redo your environmental impact report, and fix the technicality, which then takes another year plus.
Endangered Species Act, does that impinge on forest practices, the way it's been interpreted and held by the Ninth Circuit?
I'm not an expert on the Endangered Species Act, but I would say that I am sure it does.
Yeah, if I could.
Say absolutely.
Yeah, if I could.
Without a doubt.
The Ninth Circuit, the last 20 years, has been the worst in the country. Whether it's
Commercial timber harvesting or fuel reduction, we just had a case where we were representing CFA and a bunch of counties where the Trump administration had declined to list the California spotted owl as an endangered species because they felt that biology justified it. Well, Center for Biological Diversity, Sierra Forest Legacy, challenged that in federal court. Then with the change of administration, the administration said, well, we're going to go back to the drawing board and reconsider the listing. We were able to intervene in the litigation for the industry because the industry was concerned about more ESA hooks to stop fuel reduction on federal land. So there's this whole ecosystem that is making it very, very challenging. So
Yeah, I was just going to add, on the federal side, there's actually currently a case right now in the Ninth Circuit. Well, the Ninth Circuit just decided it. So there's this guy out there by the name of Chad Hansen who's going around, and he has the John Muir Project. And I remember I talked earlier about John Muir, and that's this guy's literally the name of his organization. And one of the things he's going around doing is trying to get injunctions on any kind of forestry management project. And he's actually going out there saying that the science shows that when you do forestry management, it makes the fires burn hotter and worse, right? And there was an article in the SAC-B not too long ago that called out that it's junk science. It's junk science that this guy is using to try and stop good projects from happening. And many, so overwhelmingly the experts say you need to be doing this. to reduce catastrophic wildfire. But he went in, and his group and others went into the Sierra forests, and we're trying to get an injunction where they're doing treatment after the creek fire that burned down there, and tried to get an injunction in the lower federal court. The lower federal court said, no, we believe that they've studied this issue sufficiently and that there's not impacts to species. I can't remember exactly which endangered species they were talking about, or threatened species. And they appealed it to the Ninth Circuit. And the Ninth Circuit did not overturn and say, yes, you need to file an injunction, but they said the court needed to consider further other research and other longitudinal surveys to determine if this should go forward. But so it's delaying it. And so now this goes back to that trial court. And additionally, this work is not getting done because of these kind of things that are not really based on any real science. They're not based on any really foundational thing, but they use those laws to delay the ability to do stuff on the federal side. Now that's federal. I'll just point out on the state, I had a bill last year, after all these fires and everything, to say, hey, let's just exempt CEQA. Projects where a fire safe council is doing a thinning project around a community, or they've been identified and studied as part of a greater project EIR. These are the easiest projects you can do. They're already identified. There's funding. Exempt them from CEQA. I couldn't even get a hearing on that bill in the Natural Resources Committee. The committee chairwoman told me I didn't have time to hear your bill. Literally said that. And the real reason behind it all is that Sierra Club is the gatekeeper at all these committees. And it tells, and they are in there telling staff and everybody else that these bills are bad, don't let them get through, don't let them advance, or at the very least they get watered down substantially so they don't do as much good as they can. And that's the problem on the state side right now.
I think the irony of all that is if you look at, pictures of like Yosemite Valley, speaking of John Muir, if you look at pictures of Yosemite Valley 100 years ago compared to today, the level of growth and like the tree crowns, it looks claustrophobic now compared to what it did, in the 1900s when that was the natural landscape. Today is something wholly unnatural that we have created, and it just seems so, it's ironic to just try and continue to perpetuate that as a healthy standard.
Well, panelists, thank you. That was great. Appreciate it. And I'll have the last final remarks. I'm kind of a bigger nattering nabob of negativity or negativism anyway than Anne-Marie Schubert. But I think we ought to leave the conference on an optimistic note. The book Saving California was a labor of love. It was an effort to actually provide policy ideas that might work. Now, granted, we know that no one is listening to them in the legislature. I mean, we know that. So why do we do this? And I was touched when Chris was up there. He was talking about how much he loved this state. And in my introduction, I go into that, how I moved here across, from Ohio with my dog and cats, and I crossed over near Needles, and it was 120 degrees, and I'm like, I love this state, I'm never leaving. And I've been to every one of the counties. I love the place, and I like the culture, and we all know why we love it here. So I'm not moving to Dallas, and I don't blame people who do. But and the ideas are simple, and they're not going to be paid attention to. So I just want to close with an example. I saw Bob Naylor was here, who we've worked on redevelopment and property rights issues. I want to bring up something totally unrelated: the battle against redevelopment. Just as whatever you think about redevelopment is irrelevant. I had written a lot about redevelopment agencies, how they used eminent domain, how they spent all this tax money on subsidies. I couldn't stand them. I thought it was a horrible thing. There were a number of people like Assemblyman Chris Norby and a lot of people who kept pushing redevelopment reform, and it was totally hopeless. I mean, it really was. I remember, when my first book came out called Abuse of Powers, another subtly titled thing, it was about redevelopment agencies, and it was hopeless. But we built kind of an intellectual framework for getting rid of redevelopment agencies. We pointed out what they did to budgets. We pointed out what they did to property rights. We were focused on that. And then the time came, right? Not for the right reasons. Some people complain that, Jerry Brown eliminated redevelopment agencies back in 2011 for the wrong reasons. Well, if you want to leave me $1 million in your will to spite your brother, that's fine. I don't care what the reason is, right? He got rid of it because he needed the money, and his reasons for doing it echoed the points that Chris Norby and a lot of people in the redevelopment, the anti-redevelopment world had been making for years. And I just think that's what, I just use that example because I think that's what we need to do. We need to keep building the framework, of good ideas. And when the time comes, eventually, maybe someone in a position of power will be willing to do something about it. And that's how I think that's how you could build change in an environment where change seems unlikely. So I caution against feeling dour and upset and, move wherever you want, but I don't spend my time on Realtor.com looking for ugly tract houses outside of Dallas. This is a beautiful state. Let's keep working on it. PRI has great ideas in all sorts of areas, and a lot of these ideas don't need to be partisan. I mean, it's not a partisan group. We're not partisans here. You just put out great ideas, understanding that the people who are in control right now probably are not open to them. But that does not mean they will not, they might not consider them when the time comes when there's no other choice, right? And that's what happened with redevelopment. The state ran out of money. They needed a place to find the money. Governor Brown said, redevelopment goes. Well, same CEQA. Some of these things, there will become a time when some of these things have to change. I mean, Darrell Steinberg, when he wanted that Kings Arena, CEQA had to go. Okay, that's just an exemption, and that frustrates me. But at some point, CEQA might go. We just need to keep pushing that, keep our spirits up, fight the good fight. Anyway, thanks for coming. Appreciate it.